My name is Nancy Stote. I'm a Media and Program Specialist here at the library. Welcome to everyone who's here in person, as well as those folks at home. We're so thrilled you're able to join us tonight. If you know someone who couldn't be here, tonight's program is being recorded and will be posted on the library's YouTube page. We're so excited to feature Dr. Helen Heineman tonight. She's President Emerita of Framingham State University. She will be speaking about Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, England's first woman doctor. Tonight's lecture is part of our Lifelong Learning Lecture Series in partnership with Framingham State University. I will hand it over to Dr. Heineman in a moment, but first we'd like to ask you to please silence your cell phones if you're here in the room. And this lecture will be about an hour, and then we'll take about 15 minutes at the end to have Dr. Heineman answer some questions. So if you would please hold your questions to the end, that would be great. We have some evaluation forms in the back for after the program, and we'd love to hear from you what you thought of this program tonight, as well as any ideas you might have for the future. We do want to thank our sponsors, the Joseph L. and Ray L. Freund Foundation, courtesy of Elizabeth F. Fideler. And thank you to the Friends of the Framingham Public Library who make events like this possible. If you'd like to donate to the Friends, there is a box in the back. Our next Lifelong Learning lecture will be on Thursday, October 13th, and we'll be featuring Dr. Maria Bolletino. She's an associate professor of history at Framingham State University. She will be discussing Africans' experience of the transatlantic slave trade. For more information about that and other great programs here at the library, please see our flyers in the back. And with that, it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Helen Heineman.
So I hope you can hear me on this. I want to give just a little bit of an explanation. Usually I talk about literature, only literature. And why am I talking about a woman doctor? Well, I've written a series of novels, the so-called Emma Redux novels. One is coming out this year and 2 next year. And in one of my novels, I had a doctor. And I thought, I don't know what medicine was like in the 19th century. So I started doing research. And I came upon Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, and I was immediately obsessed. And so I may write something about her, but she is a very inspirational character. And so that's why I'm talking about something that isn't literature for once in my life. I do want to recognize a fellow author in the audience, Sharon Healy Yang, who's an author of 4 mysteries. And I'm very grateful to her for putting me in touch with the press that is publishing my book. They published her book. So thank you, and I'm so glad to see you here tonight with your husband. Okay, so I'll get started. My topic, I'm not going to talk a lot about medicine and science because my brain on that side doesn't work very well. But I'm going to talk about the good life of Elizabeth Garrett and James Skelton Anderson, her husband. My opening slide is a picture of her in her prime. She's in her 30s here. And the opening chapter of this is called In the Fortress. The story of Elizabeth begins when Nathaniel Heckford met her. He was the resident accoucheur for instruction in midwifery at the London Hospital, and she was hoping to gain experience in medical and surgical nursing. He put her in charge of some cases, although the school was in an uproar because of the presence of a woman. But she conquered all hostility, and in July 1864, she was awarded a certificate attesting that she had attended. And we have first a photograph of the young, that's not it, back on, of the young Elizabeth Garrett. There she is. During this time, you can see she was very attractive. She received a marriage proposal from a close friend, Henry Fawcett. He was a professor of political economy at Cambridge. She considered it, but she refused. She thought, marriage has no place in my rigorously planned life. She was attractive. She received 3 or 4 more proposals. She also refused them. And in October of 1864, she entered her last year as a medical training and secured legal qualification in her own country. In a later letter, she wrote to someone, "I was in the fortress, so to speak." Still, she continued to be barred from any hospital appointment, but she could be a consultant physician for women and children. She found a house in Upper Berkeley Street, and she entered herself in the medical register as an LSA, a licensed apothecary. It was the lowest of the three possible medical designations. You could be a physician, you could be a surgeon, you could be an apothecary. When the hospital acquired a board, Heckfield proposed Miss Garrett as a member. And while some members were in favor, a certain James George Skelton Anderson was among those who hesitated. He thought a woman would not be able to handle what he considered a very tough job. On March 16th, Elizabeth appeared before the board, and Anderson was present to listen as she answered the questions of board members. Her answers were like herself, intelligent and forceful, and she impressed her listeners. She was also well-dressed, a very elegant-looking female. The combination probably surprised Anderson. Excellent medical knowledge, an incongruous match with an elegant female. In any case, at the end of the hearing, he changed his mind and he voted for her, making her the first woman to be recognized as a member of a board at any British hospital. Even more surprising, on impulse, he hurried after her and spoke to her on her way out. It was their first encounter, one which led to a growing friendship. He was James Skelton Anderson, a tall man with the fair coloring of a lowland Scot. This is a picture of him as a young man. Later, he became bearded. He was lanky, he had clear-cut features, he had steady eyes. In addition to being good-looking, he was charming, and she liked him. She felt sure that she had found a friend. She was committed to the success of the London hospital, and she soon had to recognize that the Heckfields were very poor managers. She discussed her reservations with Anderson, and she began meeting with him on hospital matters. She was unhappy with the way drugs were bought and kept, and she brought the subject up to him. She said, "There's no check on the druggist." By June 1870, just before she left for Paris to take her final medical exams, she had to go to Paris because no institution in England would listen to a woman take exams. So she went to the Sorbonne, and she wrote to him, she said, "Drink to my becoming a great physician on the 15th. I have 30 years of vigor before me." And she said, referring to her bodily vigor, did she signal her store of physical energy, large enough to encompass even more than her medical ambitions? But she began working closely with him to improve conditions at the hospital. The board meetings were held at his office. He had an office. He had a shipping company in Glasgow. He had an office in London, and many letters passed between them. When she returned from Paris in triumph, she had passed the exams at the Sorbonne. He was among the first to congratulate her. From that moment on, they corresponded frequently, as he was often away from London and Glasgow on the business of his shipping company. Over time, the letters grew more personal. When they discussed, I should tell you that I've had to move heaven and earth, but I have the letters. I had to pay for a lot of them, but they're coming from 2 libraries in England. Anyway, when they discussed business, he did not refrain from giving her his honest opinions, even when he was critical. He once warned her against bowing to flattery. "Too much butter," he said frankly. She appreciated his honesty, but she said, "It's only in the land of Lilliput that I could be stuck up. Thank heaven I'm not living there yet." Where plain speaking might have driven 2 others apart, these frank exchanges only strengthened their friendship. In the summer of 1870, his regiment in the London Scottish was under canvas at Wimbledon Common. He invited Elizabeth to attend. She went. chaperoned, of course, by her friend Emily Davis, and she brought with her a volume of poetry to read aloud to him. Now it seemed there was even more to share, poetry perhaps, opening more doors of potential feeling. During this visit, he wore a kilt and a bonnet and no doubt looked handsome. She must have commented on his appearance, for afterwards, in a letter, it says he gave her a photograph of himself in uniform. I wish I could find that photograph. I'm going to go after the photographs next. They were moving forward step by step. Skelton Anderson, handsome and well off, had already eluded his share of matchmaking mothers, and Elizabeth had declined at least 4 marriage proposals. Each was focused on their own interests and pursuits. Marriage was not on the agenda for either of them. On that Wimbledon visit, she learned more about his family. At 16, he had entered his family shipping firm. His family went into some financial difficulties. They were a family of 12. He helped support his brothers and sisters, and he was always regarded as a confirmed bachelor. Elizabeth occasionally asked him to dinner. She always had her friend, Miss Jane Crow, present, or a party of people. And on one occasion, she wrote him some corrections regarding his social behavior at the dinner table. And he accepted what she wrote, and she wrote back and said, "I'm grateful to you for not being vexed." When the Franco-Prussian War broke out in August 1870, she went to visit the battlefront. She took her younger brother and sister with her, and she wrote him a 10-page letter from an ambulance wagon while helping to dress the wounded. When she returned, she was invited to stand for election to the new London School Board. And this is her apprenticeship document that she had to prove as evidence that she was qualified. She agreed that she would stand on condition that Mr. Anderson be made the new chairman of the board. Whether she intended it or not, the election campaign brought them closer together. She had some important supporters, even Robert Browning, who was very enthusiastic. A magazine wrote, "Well, we will in her case put aside all controversy about women doctors and say that she is an ornament to the calling that she has embraced." That women could stand for election to the school board was an unexpected development, and 4 women presented themselves as candidates. Elizabeth agreed to be one of the 4. Although she was hesitant, she said, "It's no use asking for women to be taking into public work and then a wish to avoid publicity." She didn't want it, but she did it. She embarked upon a month of campaigning, and she and Skelton Anderson had continual meetings. Between November 8th and December 8th, she wrote him at least 14 letters. They sometimes shared quick early suppers, during which they discussed election business. She had to speak at open-air meetings. This was very unusual for a woman, and she sometimes made mistakes. He didn't refrain from correcting her, and usually at this time, a woman would have her speech read by a gentleman. But she read them, and she asked him for public support. She said to him in a letter, "It would be good if you could bear testimony to my having been of use to a committee of men. That you were against me when I applied for the post at the hospital makes your testimony more valuable." As the contest went on, Skelton continued to give her advice. One time he was very angry at one thing she did. He said to her, "You've lost yourself thousands of votes. It was most unfortunate what you said." She accepted his remarks, but she wrote back and said, "You might have perhaps said what you had to say rather more shortly." But she said, "I know I have a love of brevity." Then, surprising everyone, she won big. She received more votes than any other candidate, 50,000. The nearest competitor had only 14,000 votes. He wrote his congratulations. She responded to him in a note noting his grammatical errors. Still, she believed she had won because of his skillful management of her campaign. She wrote to him, "I wish I could find some adequate way of thanking you, but I am quite beggared. I can find no words." That Christmas, she was deluged by invitations to dinner and visits, And she wrote to Skelton saying she was going to work on a medical textbook and shut herself away like a hermit. It was perhaps something of a challenge for him to take another step toward bringing them closer. And on the day before Christmas Eve in 1870, Anderson wrote her a note to ask if he might call after dinner. It was an unusual request, like giving her that photo of himself in his kilt. This request to call on her at home in the evening was unusual, and it represented a closer step. She was aware that his request moved them into new territory, and she replied cautiously. It's wonderful that we have these early letters. He had perhaps made up his mind what he was going to say. At any rate, remember, he only followed her initially on an impulse. But he had diverted his considerable business responsibilities to manage her campaign. He had met her for many quick dinners, meetings, but never had they met alone. Once she told him of a dinner they both attended. "I was sorry to see nothing of you last night, but the room was full of people." Clearly, she was confessing she had missed him. They had developed an almost daily correspondence of brief notes, but all their meetings together were never alone. What did he want to see her about that evening after dinner? If he were to come, the proprieties demanded that they meet chaperoned. "Perhaps," she answered him, "it would be better for you not to come." For one thing, her friend and roommate, Jane Crow, had gone out for the evening and would not be present. "I should not like to confuse my sense of decorum, and I am afraid it might." And just then, fate or some second thoughts intervened. Some photographs of her had been delivered, photographs that were going to be used in campaigning. "Since writing this," she added in another note, "some pictures have come on which I want to extract an opinion the next time I see you," adding, "one does not judge well for oneself." And this is the photo that she was going to use. Perhaps because she wanted his opinion of the photos, or perhaps because she sensed that what seemed just a casual request to call on her might be something more important, she relented, and she added a sentence to her response. "Perhaps you might compromise with Mrs. Grundy if you come tonight, but do not stay so long." The second perhaps, though indicating uncertainty, had canceled the first, and so he came, arriving at Berkeley Street and drawing the door shut behind him, thus forever concealing from our view whatever occurred between them that evening. How long he stayed, what he said, what she said, is all unknown. But when he left, Elizabeth Garrett was engaged to be married to James Skelton Anderson. And this is the only picture of them together. It's their so-called engagement photo. I'm still looking. Her daughter subsequently briefly summarized the meeting with some oblique reference to how long it lasted. Quote, "The visit was long enough to allow matters to be settled between them. They became engaged." Their meeting, however private, must have included a proposal of marriage, her acceptance, surely their first embrace, maybe a kiss, and all that had been missing in the months of their growing friendship and mutual attraction. And they acted quickly, losing no time in moving further. And on the very next day, Christmas Eve, Elizabeth decided to inform her family. She left on an early train for her Attleboro home to break the news, leaving her time alone to deliver the news. He was to follow her later that day. At first, her father reacted very negatively, thinking that marriage would ruin her career. After all, he had paid for much of the education that she had, and he was thinking she was going to give it all up now that she was marrying. Well, a radiant Elizabeth met Skelton at the station, and by the next day, according to all reports, he had captivated the whole family, telling stories, dancing reels, singing songs, playing charades, and skating on the marshes. On being similarly informed, though by letter, James's father wrote his congratulations and added a heartfelt testimonial to the character of his son. James George possesses very superior abilities, an unfailing fund of wit and humor, an equal and most pleasant temper, and his life, as far as has been known to me, has been pure and honorable. Congratulations followed, especially that of Sir James Paget, the famous surgeon. I read his memoirs. He was another source for me in finding out what the life of a doctor was like. He was happily married because it was easier for a man, which meant much to Elizabeth. And he said to her, "What do you like best, Miss Garrett, being the elect of 50,000, referring to the votes by which she had won onto the board, or being the elect of one?" "I rather despise the 50,000, answered Elizabeth. "I think nothing could be happier in beginning public life than to have the 50,000, but I do despise them in comparison with the one." She wrote to her sister, "On Friday night, my horizon was suddenly changed by Mr. Anderson's asking me to marry him. We are engaged." In other letters, she always referred to the event, somewhat mysteriously, as our Friday. As soon as the announcement became known, some of her friends and associates were angry. They wondered that she was going to give everything up. Though she was intensely in love, she had to explain that her decision to marry did not mean the end of her career. One unnamed friend wrote, "You will not expect me to deny that you have given a blow, such a defection." "Well," she said, I do not think I have deserted my post. It need not prove to be so. I believe that he would regret it as much as I." And then she concluded with an important, even revolutionary statement. "I am sure that the woman question will never be solved in any complete way so long as marriage is thought to be incompatible with freedom and with an independent career. And I think there is a very good chance that James and I may be able to do something to discourage this notion." As opinions poured in, she began to feel, quote, "a rush of doubt as to the rightness of taking such an absorbing happiness. She began to feel guilty. I dread lest I may be choosing my own happiness at the price of the duty I owe to women who need something which I, as one of their leaders, can give them." She continued hard at work, snatching brief meetings with Skelton, only allowing herself a wave at his office window as she walked each morning to the hospital. While still remaining something of an icon to the independence of women, she continued to be strongly drawn to this handsome, virile man. The attraction between them grew stronger. She wrote to him on the 9th of January, "I hope it will come into your mind to provide a few crumbs for my breakfast tomorrow, dearest. There is not much to say by way of excuse. How pleasant to have left the region of excuses behind us in those dim ages before our Friday. Now our life is intolerable apart." Well, she continued to refer to his progress in winning over her father. She wrote to him, "I think you've been very successful with dear father. He did not say anything in your praise, but he was serene and affectionate. And he put his arm around me as we went home in the cab. But I have now grown so used to yours. His had more of passivity in its affection than your strong grasp. But when you have had me 30 years and more, I shall be very happy, dear love, if there is no more passivity in yours than now in his. If you starve me tomorrow morning, I can't get a word till the evening as I go from the hospital to see the Smith children. Ever yours, E.G." Her reference to his arm around her, not with passivity, but with an expression of passion, was her reference to the way in which he now belonged to her and how quickly she had become part of him. Even using his first name was a new kind of intimacy. She said in a letter to him, "I called you Skelton tonight when you were not there. I have to blush. I shall accustom myself gradually to it behind your back." It's a different world, isn't it? A few days later, in the strongest expression of her feelings, she wrote to him, "I love you more than I thought I was ever made to love anyone." There is much that is passionate in her letters. She found words to describe her passion. She was telling him as clearly as she could of her love. His letters have not survived. This is a bit of a letter from hers, not to him, but to someone else. I have no doubt that his letters matched hers in the expression of their feelings, but all of his letters have been destroyed. The date was set for the wedding. They were to be married at Easter, but they both decided they couldn't wait. And so in January, they decided to be married in February. She wanted to be married entirely without millinery. When they continued to meet alone, when he said that, perhaps they shouldn't, she wrote to him, "When you have a duenna, I'll have one. Till then, we will both be free." All in all, their engagement lasted 6 weeks, and constant letters passed between them. As I said, Jamie's letters were destroyed. Their daughter later wrote, "No key would ever keep them safe." One can only imagine why. Perhaps James himself thought they should be forever locked from public view. She didn't mind keeping her letters, but it seemed that she agreed that his be destroyed. She wrote in one, will you please, dearest, burn all the others?" She asked for no jewelry for him except what she called the Aberdeen brooch. "I should like to wear something that comes from you." There was a difficulty that needed to be made. The Married Women's Property Acts had been passed, by which a woman's earnings could now be legally hers. Before 1863, everything a woman earned belonged to her husband. Skelton had approved of the act, but he wanted a common purse with Elizabeth, and she thought that her respect for the women's movement meant that she should arrange her income in line with the first of the Women's Property Acts. He was hurt, but she had to somehow atone for falling in love and marrying. Later, her daughter explained that this financial arrangement had been unnecessary. Her daughter wrote, "The Married Women's Property Act had not been framed to protect wives from men of his stature." He wanted to set them up in a larger and more elegant residence. He had money. She wanted to stay in her house on Upper Berkeley Street, where she already had her medical practice. She conceded a little to his wishes, she said, but she asked that they stay in her house for at least a year. She didn't want to lose her patients. And it wasn't a good neighborhood that her house was in. He had to agree. She always walked to her hospital assignments in the winter through mud and ice, but he insisted on giving her a carriage as a wedding present. He added a sealskin jacket with a sable border, and she was bothered by it. She said she would enjoy the jacket only if it would not be ruinous or greedy. In the last of her engagement letters to him, she wrote, "We must not be made selfish by love." During the engagement, he usually called in the evening, but being together was proving to be an almost too powerful emotion for her. Her daughter wrote, "The joy of being with him overpowered her. She could think of nothing else, and this would not do. Their meetings must be rationed." She did not know how to handle her feelings, and she wrote of them in a letter of 2nd January, 1871. "I have been sitting half-tranced for nearly an hour since you left me, dearest, and coming to myself, I shall ask you, please do not arrange for us to meet on Wednesday. I am almost sure it would be better for us, for me at any rate, not to meet so very often. It is too distracting. And being very distracted and absorbed brings back a rush of doubt as to the rightness of taking such absorbing happiness." But she agreed that it would be best for them to be married at once. And so they moved their wedding date up. She began to speak of their arrangement as the starving process, and she said it's not pleasant. She never referred to any sexual desires as such, but during the days before her wedding made very many veiled references. Quote, "The devil is not tormenting me tonight," she wrote once, "but he was strong last night because I had done absolutely nothing but think of you for 48 hours, so that I don't feel that you will be my ruin." This time she preserved a letter that he replied. He wrote to her, "The only possible basis for us is warm, personal love and utter truth and outspokenness." Until their wedding, the warm jacket he had insisted on giving her would have to serve to take his place. She wrote, "I feel sure I should be shy in the sealskin jacket unless with you. It would be pleasant to consecrate it by 5 minutes with you before going out in it. I am beginning to believe that we beat in unison and harmony, and that when I want you, you want me." Letters are this passionate, one can only imagine the intensity of his, which were destroyed. The revelation of love was overwhelming to her, and while some predicted disaster for the marriage, their daughter wrote, from her own personal vantage, the future held great happiness for them both. As the days passed, she worked steadily. On her wedding day, she worked seeing patients all day. One of the most unusual aspects of this unusual wedding was that she had been wearing her wedding ring for 2 to 3 days before the wedding. She received it in mail from him. Some scholars say perhaps she wore it because she feared he might lose it. More probably, I think she already felt married to him, because on that night he visited and saw her alone, they had pledged their own binding troth. She more than once referred to that evening as our Friday. She had certainly not been a woman primarily interested in marriage. As I've told you, she turned down 4 proposals. She had found her occupation. She was a doctor in the world. She could support herself. She had always been an advocate for women's occupation. She had 4 sisters. She tried hard to get them some kind of employment. It was impossible. A woman couldn't even be a clerk, a typist. Either it was a governess or a nurse, which was disreputable, or wait around for marriage. And she wrote to her mother a letter saying, "Girls are dreadfully puzzling. How it would simplify matters if they just all got married at 20, or doomed forever to be single. When the craving for a more fully developed life comes to a girl, she doesn't know whether to smother it or encourage it." She did encourage her sisters. Once she employed one as a housekeeper, another as a companion for a time. She thought it was wonderful that a healthy woman should spend a long life in comparative idleness, than that she should wish for some suitable work on which she could spend the energy. For her, it had been her life in medicine. That makes all the more powerful her attraction to Anderson and the suddenness of their betrothal on the evening of our Friday. He too had been a confirmed bachelor in his 30s, a successful businessman. He had his own interests, his own friends and families, yet neither of them hesitated a moment after their short evening together alone. Yet on the night before their wedding, before the morning of the service, he was jittery. He complained of a headache. He said it was bad wine. He threatened everybody that he was going to be married in his old clothes. But his brother took him off to a Scottish clothing establishment and got him suitably dressed, and said he looked very well, though he was a little nervous. From that moment, he was restored, and he rode first in the parade of carriages to the church in an open carriage and pair with his father and the bishop. We know something of these details because Jamie's sister-in-law wrote a 14-page letter describing the wedding. She reported the sun was shining on that day. Jamie and Elizabeth appeared unmistakably happy. Gifts had been received. She received a handsome opal ring set in diamonds from Jamie's brother. His father sent a locket. After dinner, again, she had worked all day. She went to bed. And she had been at the school board also for a meeting and had seen patients. When the family left for the night, the bishop unburdened himself. "She's a nice creature and a sensible, They're a clever pair. What will the bairns be? Upstairs in the smoking room, an argument was underway about the word obey in the marriage ceremony. It had been eliminated from the ceremony. Jamie's sister-in-law was upset. She declared, quote, he was going to let her off cheaper than other women if he did not make her promise to obey. But Jamie had agreed to omit the offensive word and defended his decision, saying that love and fidelity comprehended everything, even shaking his fists at everyone in a way that silenced all argument. He seemed to be in something of a state. Elizabeth also had some last-minute feminine concerns about a boil on her cheek and even thought of delaying the wedding as a consequence, but Skelton refused. They had set the time for their marriage unfashionably early in the day, for they wanted no crowds. They had to rise between 6 and 7. Wedding was at 8:30. And Jamie was reported to be wandering about the house like a fish out of water. The bride's party was already at the church, and in the opinion of Jamie's sister-in-law, thought they were not well dressed enough. She said they were quite in everyday dress, sealskin jackets, dark dresses, and bonnets, while Jamie's family looked quite a vision of magnificence. The bride finally arrived, quote, shamefully unpunctual, with her father and mother, wearing a modest gown of stone gray velvet with a matching velvet bonnet, adorned with a single pink rose. As she approached Skelton, she slipped the ring into his hand. In speaking the vows, he was asked if he would be a faithful and loving husband to her, and after agreeing, managed to slip in another word for Elizabeth. Would she be a faithful, loving, and dutiful wife? Asking her to be dutiful seemed a sufficient substitute for the word obey. Both agreed to the vows, answering distinctly and scandalizing her sister-in-law. Her new husband held Elizabeth's hand so tightly that it could be seen. But at the ceremony's end, another unusual touch. The bishop tried to hurry around the table for the first kiss, but they were too quick for him. Elizabeth touched Jamie and held up her face to be kissed by her new husband before the bishop could reach her. They kissed deeply, almost as if they were the only ones present. During their engagement, Skelton had written, the only possible basis for us is warm personal love and utter truth and outspokenness. From all outward appearances, their love was indeed warm. As she told her brother-in-law, it is so much more than I deserve to have such a blessing for all the rest of our lives. They were to have 36 years together, and through everything they were to face, secure in their love. Their daughter later described their union as one of strong wills, but they shared understanding and sympathy, each completed without hampering the life of the other. They began their domestic life by arranging it somewhat in accord with that of their contemporaries. She had won the discussion about not immediately removing to a grander home, and he moved into her Berkeley Street residence, but they added a smoking room for him. Their daughter thought that he, more than she, realized the possible stumbling blocks in their marriage. Some of his friends said he was doomed to oblivion, the husband of a celebrity. But together they had agreed that he was to be master in his own house and not the latest addition to his mistress's furniture. Both put duty before pleasure in all their activities, and their mutual love softened them. They trusted one another. Elizabeth wrote, I cannot imagine that we should ever take opposed views as long as we both desire to see what is right and reasonable and to live up to the highest possibilities of our nature, adding, we must not be made selfish by love. As for servants, they added only a cook and a housemaid. The house had 5 floors with no electricity, no central heating. She planned her routine. She cleaned and polished. She made him a healthy Aberdeen breakfast each morning. She did the gardening. She gave dinner parties. True companions, their relationship was revolutionary for their time. In their work, they were separate and independent, though each was ready to help the other if asked. At home, they shared their mutual interests in books, theater, music, conversation, and especially liked walking in the countryside. That first spring, in April 1871, they took a week's vacation on a walking tour in the Scottish hills. With his support, some of it financial, she opened a new hospital for women, its working staff consisting entirely of women. Sex antagonism, her biographer wrote, has no part in her nature. She had been supported by men, by her father, by Skelton most of all. She drew away from the more fiery battles of some of the suffragettes, with whom she had a difficult, sometimes stormy relationship. By marriage, she had gained balance and power. She said, "I did not know I had it in me to care so much for anyone. What a prize I have." In her memoir, their daughter recalled the unusual devotion of her father for her mother. Jamie did not understand jealousy, she said. He delighted in his wife's interests, which to a great extent he shared. Her position, her success, her achievement pleased him. Her cause became his cause. It was to be a partnership of equals. During the first 7 years of their married life, 3 children were born to Elizabeth and Skelton. The first was Louisa, christened Louisa Garrett Anderson. They had a wet nurse and a nanny, and she played with Louisa every evening. When she was a little older, she took her on carriage rides when she went to see her patients. It's not a surprise that her daughter became a surgeon. Then when Louisa was 6 months old, Elizabeth was again pregnant. She delivered her second child, Margaret Skelton Anderson. That fall, Elizabeth and Skelton took another rare week together walking in the Yorkshire Dales. This was to be the last unmixed happiness they were to enjoy for some time. Few family letters illustrate these years. Their daughter speculates probably few were written, as husband and wife rarely separated, only when some new shipbuilding called him to Glasgow. When she made trips, she always wrote of missing him. "I wish you were with me. I don't like leaving you in the bairns, though I do most thoroughly enjoy the sense of holiday, turning one's mind away from medicine and seeing the out-of-London world." From several places she wrote, again, "I wish you were here. I am longing to see you again. I hope you won't get used to doing without me. I am longing to see them and you." Sometimes they could snatch some holiday time together. Then their great trial came upon them. In the winter of 1875, their second child, Margaret, a flaxen-haired doll of a babe, became ill and had convulsions. Skelton was in Glasgow at the shipyard, and Elizabeth wrote to him in alarm. She asked him to come home, and he hurried there to find Margaret worse, and Elizabeth weary and anxious. The baby grew worse in December, and Skelton took the place of Elizabeth and the nurse, and for whole nights paced up and down the nursery floor, soothing the dying child with his firm, gentle hands. She died on December 15th, her head resting on her father's cheek. Elizabeth was so overcome, she needed a 2-month break to recover her balance before returning to her hospital work. But grief did not separate them, as it sometimes happens. Indeed, they grew even closer, heartbroken and puzzled by the cause of their loss. Then, by the summer of 1876, Elizabeth was pregnant again, and on the 9th of March gave birth to a son. She had wanted another daughter, especially for Louisa, who missed her baby sister. This is a picture of that time. Elizabeth was about, 6 or 7 when her baby sister died, and this is a photo that we have of that time. But she was happy that Skelton had a son. He was christened Alan Garrett Anderson. While still lying in and recuperating, she continued to be actively involved in the new hospital. She did teaching boards for women. Her work even drew the attention of Clara Schumann, who came and gave a concert for the benefit of the hospital. That year, she was instrumental in the campaign to admit women to all degrees of London University, and she continued to give lectures on medical subjects. The next batch of family letters were written when Alan was 2, and Mr. Anderson was again in Scotland at the shipyards, supervising the building of a steamship. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson once described the work of a doctor's life and the personal relationship with her husband. "The fact is," she wrote, "a doctor leads two lives, the professional and the private, and the boundaries between the two are never traversed." But was that strictly true in the 36 years these two unusual people would have lived together? Did they succeed in keeping these two lives totally separate? Her medical life was aimed at maintaining the health of her patients, continuing her research into the many causes of disease. Yet she had been unable to save one of her own children from the ravages of meningitis. And when illness struck, she had called her husband home from the Glasgow shipyards to help, excusing herself for broaching the boundaries. "My chief reason," she wrote, "for having asked you to come home was feeling that it was possible I might knock up before she was quite well. I don't think I shall, but if I did, I should like you to be here to look after her." And of course he hurried home to help. Elizabeth was completely exhausted during this time, and it was an obvious departure from the separation of the professional and the private. She continued to give considerable time and thought to her husband's business career, which was doing quite well. He loved ships and the sea and had founded the Orient Shipping Line. Early in their engagement, he too had vowed to separate the personal and the professional, writing to her, "I take a decided line in this matter. I mean to be, if I can, a successful line of business, a successful man of business, neither interfering with your pursuits nor being interfered with by you." But then he added, "but having our confidences at off times and mutually advising and fortifying one another." As her biographer Joe Manton puts it, at least half the credit for the success of that marriage must go to him. When she inherited West Hill from her father, they spent holidays there. They shared the property. He loved to play golf. He helped doing the shopping. Whenever business or shipbuilding at Glasgow kept him away, she wrote him all the details of her daily life and that of her children. They had one other scare when the 11-and-a-half-year-old Louisa fell suddenly ill. This time, Skelton could not be with her, as he had been summoned to Aberdeen to his father's deathbed. Again, their letters sustained them. She wrote to Skelton, "We must try to be brave, do what is right, and have self-command enough not to neglect any chance, but oh, it is hard. That sweet darling, the very center of our heart's love. I always thought of her as securely ours for years." Fortunately, the crisis passed and Louisa recovered, though she was left fretful and depressed. This time, the Andersons decided that the personal overruled the professional. They decided to take a family sea voyage in early 1885, a 6-month journey to Australia. And by the way, I've learned in these letters that Elizabeth was terribly prone to seasickness. I can't imagine a long sea voyage to Australia. Anyway, there are no letters from that period. One can only speculate on what must have been a difficult decision, but for once the personal had trumped the professional. The sea air would be good for both children and the rest good for their parents. By 1885, they were back. She returned to her medical work, he to the shipping business. But clearly, the welfare of the children always came first. She lived a happy life with her husband, her children, and her career. As she herself had once written, "The woman question will never be solved in any complete way so long as marriage is thought to be incompatible with freedom and an independent career." In 1902, they gave up active work in London and moved to Attleborough, that was her hometown, and they both found new interests. Their daughter wrote, "She sends the affectionate letters of a busy woman. Public events jostle with the maladies of the children." Her daughter, Louisa Garrett, recalled those years, writing that to her children, especially when they were at school, she wrote with unfailing regularity, sending 2 letters a week to each. Their daughter stated, rather proudly, she gave affection to her husband in later life to her children, but to no one else. She added that her mother avoided the mistake of many parents. Quote, she did not treat us as children. When we began to think of ourselves as grown-up, she accepted our opinions and took our advice. It's quite a tribute. And both the Anderson children became very successful, Louisa as a surgeon and Alan as an executive in his father's shipping company. When Alan married and had 4 children of his own, Elizabeth and Skelton were proud grandparents. The grandchildren they called our beloved, the joys of our lives. This is her daughter, obviously in later life as a surgeon, and she was a medical pioneer, she was a suffragette, she was a social reformer. She became chief surgeon to the Women's Hospital Corps, a fellow of the Royal Society of Medicine. Her partner was a fellow doctor and suffragette. She was appointed to the Order of the British Empire as commander for her work in treating wounds in both world wars. Her son, Alan Garrett Anderson, was a member of Parliament. He helped his country through both world wars. He served as a colonel in the unit of the Gloucestershire Regiment, was widely honored, appointed a knight commander of the Order of the British Empire. He was involved with the hospital named in honor of his mother and was active in the London School of Medicine for Children. And as I said, he had 4 children, and 2 of his children were knighted. They also were very great public servants. In her later years, Elizabeth traveled much, either with her husband or with parties of young children, especially her children. Often Skelton couldn't leave his office for longer trips, but he never deprived her of holidays when he couldn't join her. When he couldn't join her, she always wrote him every day, noting places for them to go in the future on our next trip together. Her letters radiated her affection for him and the pleasure she took while traveling, and often her son Alan was her escort. When she resigned from the staff of the new hospital, she continued to write papers on medicine. She was particularly, this is interesting for us, she was particularly keen on the benefits of vaccination for smallpox. We're thinking about the COVID vaccinations. It was a controversial subject at the time, whether or not you got vaccinated against smallpox. She was a fierce advocate. She wrote in one article, has anyone ever met a doctor in a smallpox hospital who was an anti-vaccinator? She believed vaccination could rid the world of diphtheria, malaria, tuberculosis, and cancer. Of course, in the latter, she was not right. In 1896, she and Skelton celebrated their silver wedding anniversary. Their marriage had been a great success, a true working partnership. They were united, yet independent, loyal and affectionate, yet unpossessive in their personal relationships. The letters reveal a deep mutual interest in international affairs, in books, social activities, even in the details of domestic life. When they did disagree, it was gently and lovingly, never losing their deep love for one another. Just before their children began their own careers, the Andersons took one last family holiday, a 10 days walking trip in Brittany. In 1900, after a winter illness, her husband's health began to flag. This is a photo of the older James Skelton Anderson. They went together to France, to Cannes, so that he could rest. And in 1902, when she was 65 and Skelton had retired, they moved to Attleboro. She wrote to her friend of the immense blessing their life together had been. He was elected mayor of Aldeburgh, and along with Elizabeth, gave great service to the town. She gardened, he golfed, they entertained visitors. Louisa took her MD in 1900. Alan married in 1902, the grandchildren becoming the joy of their lives. Then in March of 1907, Skelton Anderson had a stroke, and they removed to London for consultation. He had a second stroke in his daughter's rooms, and when he died, Elizabeth was with him. When friends sympathized, Elizabeth's one recorded comment was that he lived a very good life. It was a characteristic comment, keeping her own love for him buried deep in her own heart, not for public view. She wrote to the council at Attleboro, "I feel that the loss we have suffered is shared by all who knew him." She had a bed at the new hospital endowed and dedicated in his name. And he had been a great contributor to the various hospitals during his life. As for herself, as her biographer wrote, she aged notably after his death, missing the balance and humor he had always provided. She permitted a photo be taken of herself in widow's garb, and then in what was no doubt her final public testimonial to the man with whom she had shared her life, at the age of 71, accepted an appointment following his as mayor of Aldeburgh. Just before she died herself, 10 years later, and before her mind totally clouded, walking once hand in hand with one of her grandsons, she confided, "I have had a very happy life." It was a happiness she had shared ever since she had married with her husband, James Skelton Anderson. In these words, she almost exactly repeated the words she had written on his death. He had a very good life. Indeed, it was true of both of them. This is, go back this for a moment, back to the famous painter Sargent did a portrait of her, and she insisted, she didn't want to wear a dress, a fancy dress. She insisted on wearing her medical robes, and the only concession she gave, and you can hardly see it, was a necklace. Sargent wanted her to wear jewels and have a kind of a more elegant portrait. But this is John Singer Sargent's portrait of Elizabeth Garrett Anderson. And then next, if you go to England today, you will find this plaque. These are the famous blue plaques in London, where they put them on the house of anyone who's famous. She has one, Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, 1836, 1917, the first woman to qualify as a doctor in Britain, lived here. And then, of course, one more look at the only picture I have of the two of them, their engagement photo. So I've come in just a few minutes under an hour, and I'm open to any questions or comments you'd like to make. Yes?
You mentioned that you read, I think, the memoir of...
Yeah, I should say there are 3 books, only 3. One is a very good biography written in 1965 by a woman named Jo Manton, M-A-N-T-O-N. I rely heavily on that book. I liked it a lot. But there was a time when someone was threatening to write another book about her, and her daughter got upset about it, and she said, "I'm going to write one." So the second book is a memoir by Louisa Garrett Anderson of her mother. It doesn't really contain all that much different stuff, but it's good. It's all right. But Jo Manton is really a kind of good, readable biography. There is another book called, I think it's called, is it called Difficult Women or something like that, which you can't get in this country, so never mind even telling you the name of it. I had to buy it from England, and I can tell you it costs a fortune. But it tells a lot of the details of the medical lives of women. I mean, it's incredible what they went through. They would go to the lecture hall if they wanted to hear a lecture, let's say on chemistry, and the men would mock them, shout at them, take their seats in the street, throw mud at them. I mean, it's unbelievable. And say they couldn't concentrate if they had a woman in the same room for an anatomy lesson. It was improper because there was a body on the table and they couldn't concentrate with a woman in the room. And this went on for many years. That's why she had to take her medical final degree at the Sorbonne. So did the first American woman doctor, Elizabeth Blackwell. You couldn't do it in England until sometime later. I mean, her daughter, obviously by that time it had changed. So anyway, this other book is more not only about Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, but about other women who went through to eventually become doctors.
And did you also, you talked about the letters.
Yeah.
Did you acquire those letters in handwritten form and have to read them, or
No.
did somebody transcribe them?
No, there are 2 places. There's the Fawcett Library in London, and I haven't got all of them from them yet because they are digitizing them, and she's told me that by the end of November I can have them. But Suffolk had letters. They wouldn't tell me what was in them.
Suffolk University?
No, it's an archive, Suffolk
Okay,
Archive. And so I had to buy them, and it was a lot of money. But I just said I'm going to buy them. And anyway, I can't say that there's a lot of them. I've gone through them quickly. There are no letters from 1870 and 1871, which were the two periods that I really wanted. So I'm hoping that the other ones that are in the Fawcett collection might have some of those other letters. So they exist in these libraries. They've been transcribed. You can't get them from Suffolk without paying for them, and it's a lot of money because you have to get them sent and all that stuff. But the Fawcett, they said by the end of November, they will be available digitized online. But that's all there is. Yes, Bob?
Yes, I was wondering, I had read the Blackwell women
Yes,
recent book.
Elizabeth Blackwell.
But I'm just wondering, did they have any connection?
The only connection, there was a connection. Elizabeth's inspiration was Elizabeth Blackwell came to England and gave lectures. And she attended one of them. I'm not sure which one. I can't quite figure that out. But she then said that's what raised in her mind the idea that she could too become a doctor. So there was an inspirational connection. I don't believe they ever met. But Elizabeth Blackwell she was famous because she was the first American woman doctor. And she came to England and gave these lectures. Some of them were in London. And Elizabeth Garrett went to one of them and was so inspired that she decided that she wanted to become a doctor. That's a good question.
Would you be able to repeat the question?
Oh, I'm sorry. Bob asked, was there a connection between Elizabeth Blackwell, the first American woman doctor, and Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, the first English? And as I said, it was an inspiration. There are connections that are more important than meeting in person. She inspired her. Yeah. Yes?
I got lost in the love story. Could you remind me what her medical specialty was?
Her medical specialty, could I remind as to what her medical, you got lost in the love story, me too. Her medical specialty, she was a generalist, but she mainly treated women. Women wanted to be treated by women. There are accounts I read some actually just today in an article that I read that a woman comes in and she's got some symptoms and the doctor says, well, you know, you're nervous. You need to go to bed and just lie there, stop doing everything. And so that was the prescription. And so Elizabeth Garrett, she did believe it was bad for women to sit around and do nothing. She wanted her sisters to do something. The thing was, there was nothing they could do. Her father had a counting house. He wouldn't even let one of his daughters come in and do clerking. You know, it just was she treated women. She did a lot of midwifery. She delivered a lot of babies. She delivered, there was a set of twins from a very, some countess somewhere in the north of England, and she had heard about her, and she asked that she come and deliver them, and she would pay plenty for her to get up there. And one of the twins died. But the woman didn't blame her because it was quite clear that she was lucky that she had one child out of that delivery. So she did midwifery, a lot of midwifery. She was a generalist. She wasn't a specialist of any particular one. Yes?
Was the new hospital for women that you spoke of in London?
Yes, was the new hospital in London. Yes, it was. And she was one of the founders of it. She has so many accomplishments, it's hard to mention them all. But she, with the East London Hospital for Children, she was very, very interested in treating children. And she co-founded the London School of Medicine for Women. She did not have a good relation. There was another woman, Sophia Jex Blake, who was also a doctor. But she got her degree in Scotland. You couldn't do it in England. London University was closed. You couldn't get it. And this woman was very angry and was a suffragette. I mean, why not? But Elizabeth Garrett Anderson believed that that wasn't the way to make changes, that she wanted to make changes in a different way. And so Jex Blake was very angry with her for that, and eventually got out. She was a co-founder of this hospital, and then she left. She said, I don't want anything to do with Elizabeth Garrett because she won't do these other things that we want to do, which is go on hunger strikes, throw bricks through windows. It was the time of that woman going to the racetrack and going under the horse, dying under the horse. She believed that she wanted to make changes, obviously, but she didn't believe in doing it that way. And so she often didn't engage in that kind of suffragette activity. And there was plenty of it coincident with the time that she was working. Yeah.
And does the new hospital for women still exist today, or has it been demolished?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
I haven't followed that up. Thank you. Anything else? Well, it's a wonderful story of a wonderful woman, and I'm happy that you were here tonight to share with me. Thank you.
I would just like to thank Dr. Heineman for her expertise and excellent program as always.
And I want to thank Ann Roberti, who is my technology person.
Thank you, Anne.
It helps me find the slides and get them together, because I do believe in visual. I wish I had more. I'm so upset that there's no wedding picture. I have found a wedding picture of her sister and her husband, but there's none of her. Why? So I don't know. To be continued.
Well, thank you all for attending, both here at the library and at home. And I'm just going to remind people here that there's an evaluation form in the back. We would love if you would fill that out, and you could just leave it on the table face down if you like. Thank you again. Have a good evening.